When billionaire CEO Isabella Grant's $400,000 Rolls-Royce broke down, where 5 master mechanics failed, she never expected salvation to come from a broken-down Detroit garage run by a widowed father fighting to survive. But sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles emerge from the most impossible places. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story, and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale of transformation travels across the world. The October rain hammered Detroit like bullets against bulletproof glass, each drop carrying the weight of a city that had forgotten how to dream. In the heart of what locals called the Forgotten District, where abandoned factories stood like tombstones against a gray sky, Ethan Cole wiped grease-stained hands on coveralls that had seen better decades. His garage, Cole's Auto Repair, squatted between a boarded-up diner and a vacant lot where weeds grew through cracked concrete like nature's quiet rebellion against urban decay. "Dad, the power company called again," 12-year-old Lila announced from behind the parts counter, her voice carrying the premature weight of a child who'd learned too young that bills didn't pay themselves. Her school backpack sat open beside a calculator and a stack of invoices homework forgotten in favor of the arithmetic that determined whether they'd eat mac and cheese or actual food this week. Ethan looked up from the engine bay of a 1998 Honda Civic, a car almost as old as his daughter's dreams, and felt that familiar knot tighten in his stomach, the one that came when reality pressed against hope like a vice. "How much time do we have?" 3 days before they shut it off. Lila's fingers moved across the calculator keys with the precision of an accountant, though she should have been worrying about algebra tests and boy bands. "But if Mrs. Henderson pays for her transmission work, and if Mr. Garcia comes back for his brake job, we might make it through the month." If. The word that had defined Ethan's life since Maria died 2 years ago, leaving him with a brilliant daughter, a struggling business, and a broken heart that refused to heal properly. He'd tried everything: 12-hour days, weekends spent hunched over engines while other fathers watched football, even swallowing his pride to ask for extensions on loans that seemed to multiply like rabbits in the dark corners of his desk drawer. "We'll figure it out, kiddo," he said, the lie tasting like motor oil on his tongue. "We always do." But the truth sat between them like an uninvited guest at dinner. The neighborhood was dying. One by one, his regular customers had moved away or found cheaper mechanics in the suburbs. The big chain stores with their diagnostic computers and factory-trained technicians were bleeding him dry, offering convenience and warranties he couldn't match. Ethan Cole was becoming extinct, a relic of an age when mechanics fixed things instead of replacing them, when knowing an engine's heartbeat mattered more than reading error codes. The storm outside intensified, turning the narrow street into a river that carried away cigarette butts, fast food wrappers, and whatever remained of the American dream in this forgotten corner of Detroit. Lightning flickered across the sky, like God's own electrical system, shorting out, and thunder rolled through the concrete canyons with the deep rumble of a well-tuned V8. "Dad," Lila's voice pulled him from his thoughts. That college brochure came again, from MIT. Ethan's chest tightened. MIT. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology had been courting his daughter since she'd won the state science fair with a water purification system built from spare parts she'd found in his garage. Full scholarship potential, they said. A future brighter than the LED headlights on the luxury cars he'd never own. But MIT cost money they didn't have room and board books, living expenses that might as well have been denominated in Martian currency. Even with a full ride, they'd need thousands for the extras, the little things that separated scholarship kids from the ones whose parents could write checks without checking bank balances first. "Put it with the others," he said quietly, trying not to think about the growing stack of opportunities his daughter couldn't afford to pursue. The Honda's engine coughed back to life a small victory in a war he seemed destined to lose. Ethan had always believed that if you treated machines with respect, understood their language of pistons and pressure, they'd reward your patience. Engines didn't lie, didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They were honest in ways people had forgotten how to be. "Mr. Cole." Lila was looking at something outside her face pressed against the rain-streaked window. "There's a car out there." Ethan glanced up, expecting to see another neighbor's broken-down sedan, or maybe a lost tourist who'd taken a wrong turn somewhere around Prosperity. Instead, his wrench slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers. A silver Rolls-Royce Phantom glided through the rain like a ghost made of chrome and leather dreams. It moved with the silent power of money, its headlights cutting through the storm like twin lighthouses guiding ships away from rocky shores. The car was pristine, flawless, the kind of automotive perfection that existed in magazines and billionaire driveways, not in neighborhoods where people counted quarters for laundry money. "Jesus," Ethan whispered, then caught himself. "Sorry, Lila." "It's okay, Dad. I was thinking the same thing." The Rolls-Royce pulled up to the garage with the careful precision of a surgeon making an incision. Through the rain-blurred windshield, Ethan could make out a figure in the driver's seat. A woman, he thought, though the storm made details impossible. The engine shut off with the whispered silence that only comes from engineering, so advanced it might as well be magic. For a long moment, nothing happened. The storm continued its assault on the neighborhood, turning gutters into rivers and streets into lakes. Lightning painted the world in stark black and white photographs that lasted just long enough to burn themselves into memory. And still the Rolls-Royce sat like a silver question mark against the chaos. "Should we go out there?" Lila asked. Before Ethan could answer, the driver's door opened. A woman emerged, and even in the storm, even at a distance, he could tell she belonged to a different world. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted whether she could pay for groceries, never stayed awake at night, calculating whether choosing between electricity and heat was really a choice at all. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than Ethan's truck, and her dark hair was pulled back in the kind of professional style that suggested boardrooms and power lunches. But it was the way she looked at his garage that made him curious. Not with the disdain he might have expected, but with something that looked almost like hope. She ran through the rain with quick, purposeful steps, and Ethan found himself moving toward the door before he'd consciously decided to do so. He pulled it open just as she reached the entrance, and for a moment, they stood there separated by the threshold between his world and hers. "Are you open?" she asked, and her voice carried an accent that spoke of expensive schools and international boardrooms. But underneath the polish, Ethan heard something else. Desperation, maybe. Or the kind of frustration that comes when money can't solve a problem. "Yes, ma'am. Come in, get out of that rain." She stepped inside, water dripping from her clothes onto the oil-stained concrete floor. Up close, Ethan could see she was probably in her early 40s, with the kind of understated elegance that didn't need to announce itself. Her eyes were deep brown, intelligent, and currently focused on him, with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of his grease-stained coveralls and calloused hands. "I'm Isabella Grant," she said, extending a hand that was soft, but carried a surprisingly firm grip, "and I have a problem that no one seems able to solve." "Ethan Cole. And problems are kind of my specialty." He gestured toward the Rolls-Royce, which sat in the rain like a displaced piece of heaven. "Though I've got to admit I don't usually work on cars worth more than my house." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "Right now it's not worth anything if it won't run." "What seems to be the trouble?" Isabella moved toward the window, looking out at her stranded vehicle. "It started 3 weeks ago. The engine would occasionally lose power just for a second or two, then it would be fine. I took it to the Rolls-Royce dealership in Birmingham. They ran every diagnostic test. They had replaced parts that didn't need replacing and charged me enough to fund a small revolution. But the problem didn't go away. It got worse. The power losses became more frequent, more severe. They sent it to a specialist in Chicago. He spent a week on it, replaced the entire fuel system, and proudly announced it was fixed. She turned back to Ethan, frustration evident in every line of her posture. 2 days later, it died completely. Just stopped running in downtown Chicago traffic. Ethan nodded, his mind already shifting into diagnostic mode. Engine problems were like puzzles, and he'd always been good at puzzles. Where did you go next? Milwaukee. There's a shop there that specializes in European luxury cars. German-trained technicians, computer systems worth more than most cars. They kept it for 10 days, replaced components I can't even pronounce, and swore they'd found the issue. Isabella's laugh was bitter as month-old coffee. It ran perfectly for exactly 37 miles. And then, back to the dealership. This time they brought in a factory specialist from England. A man who'd worked on these engines for 25 years, who talked about them like they were his children. He was so confident, so sure he could fix what everyone else had missed. Ethan could see where this was going. But he couldn't. 3 weeks of work. He replaced practically everything under the hood that could be replaced. The bill was substantial. And for 6 days it ran like new. I started to believe it was finally over. She paused, staring out at the storm. Then driving through downtown Detroit an hour ago, it died again. This time for good. And you ended up here. I called every high-end shop in the city. They're all booked solid, or they want to schedule me for next month, or they take one look at the diagnostic history and suddenly remember they're not taking new clients. Isabella turned back to him, and he could see the weight of frustration and something else, the kind of desperation that came when you'd run out of logical options. Your shop was the only one that answered the phone. Lila looked up from her homework where she'd been pretending not to eavesdrop. Dad answers even when we're closed. He says you never know when someone might really need help. Smart philosophy, Isabella said, and for the first time since entering the garage, she seemed to really see where she was. Her eyes took in the organized chaos of spare parts, the tools that were old, but well-maintained, the evidence of decades spent making broken things whole again. I know this isn't exactly your usual clientele. Ethan found himself studying her more carefully. There was something about Isabella Grant that didn't quite fit the stereotype of the wealthy executive he'd imagined. Yes, she had money, the kind that came with power and responsibility, but she wasn't looking down at his garage with disgust or condescension. If anything, she seemed curious. Ma'am, I'll be straight with you. I've never worked on a Rolls-Royce. Don't have the fancy diagnostic equipment. Those other shops don't have factory training or certification papers to hang on my wall. What I do have is 40 years of listening to engines, of understanding what they're trying to tell me when they're hurting. 40 years. Started working on cars when I was 12, helping my father in his shop. Been running this place for the last 20. He gestured toward Lila, who was now openly watching their conversation. Teaching my daughter everything I know, though she's already smarter than I'll ever be. Isabella's gaze shifted to Lila, and something softened in her expression. What are you studying? Mechanical engineering principles mostly, Lila answered with the casual confidence of a child who'd grown up around technical discussions. But I'm also interested in sustainable energy systems and how traditional combustion engines might be adapted for hybrid applications. Isabella's eyebrows rose. That's quite advanced for someone your age. She's 12 going on 30, Ethan said with pride that couldn't be hidden. Smarter than her old man ever was. She's got a full scholarship opportunity at MIT if we can figure out how to make it work. The words hung in the air like smoke from an exhaust pipe, carrying with them all the hope and heartbreak of dreams just barely out of reach. Isabella studied both of them for a moment, and Ethan had the strange feeling she was seeing something he couldn't identify. "Mr. Cole," she said finally, "5 specialists with decades of experience, millions of dollars in diagnostic equipment and factory support couldn't solve my problem. What makes you think you can—" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Ethan looked out at the Rolls-Royce, its silver paint reflecting the store like liquid mercury. In the lightning flashes, he could see it clearly, beautiful, expensive, and completely helpless. "Maybe I can't," he said. "Maybe those other mechanics are right, and there's something wrong with your car that can't be fixed with old-fashioned know-how and intuition. But here's the thing about engines, Ms. Grant. They all speak the same language at heart. Doesn't matter if it's a Honda Civic or a Rolls-Royce Phantom. They all breathe air, burn fuel, and turn chemical energy into motion. Strip away the fancy electronics and computer controls and you're left with the same basic principles that powered the first horseless carriages." Isabella was listening intently, her business executive mask slipping to reveal genuine curiosity. "Those other mechanics, they're all trying to solve your problem, the same way with computers and diagnostic codes and replacement parts. But sometimes the answer isn't in the manual. Sometimes you have to listen to what the engine is actually telling you. And you think you can hear something they couldn't." Ethan shrugged, suddenly aware of how presumptuous his words might sound. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just a small-town mechanic who's about to embarrass himself in front of a woman who could probably buy and sell this whole neighborhood without checking her bank balance. But if you're willing to let me try, I promise you this, I'll treat your car like it was my own. And I won't charge you a penny unless I can actually fix it." The offer hung between them like a bridge across a canyon neither of them had expected to find. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Detroit. But inside the garage, something else was building, the kind of electricity that comes when two different worlds discover they might have more in common than they thought. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Ethan to Lila to the garage around them. He could almost see her weighing options, calculating risks, trying to reconcile her logical business mind with something that felt dangerously close to faith. "The other mechanics," she said slowly, "they all wanted payment up front. Diagnostic fees, labor estimates, parts, deposits. They treated my problem like a transaction. That's not how I work." "How do you work, Mr. Cole?" Ethan thought about the question, trying to put into words something he'd never really had to explain before. "I work like problems matter more than profit. Like fixing something that's broken is worth doing even if it doesn't make business sense. Like sometimes the most important job you'll ever do is the one that doesn't pay enough to cover your costs." Isabella's smile was small but genuine. "That's either very noble or very impractical. In my experience, the two aren't mutually exclusive." Lightning cracked across the sky like God's own exclamation point, and in its brief illumination, Ethan saw something shift in Isabella's expression. Decision, maybe, or the kind of desperate hope that comes when you've run out of logical alternatives and have to trust something that feels dangerously close to magic. "All right, Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand again. "You've got yourself a customer. But I have one condition." "What's that?" "If you can't fix it, I still want to pay you for your time. A mechanic's expertise has value whether the job succeeds or fails." Ethan shook her hand, noting again the contrast between her soft skin and surprisingly strong grip. "Deal. But if I can fix it, you let me teach you how I figured it out. Fair trade of knowledge for knowledge." "Why would that matter to you?" Because understanding is worth more than money. And because maybe, just maybe, I can show you something those expensive specialists missed. Isabella Grant looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan had the strange feeling she was seeing him. Really seeing him for the first time. Not just the grease-stained mechanic in the failing garage, but something else. Something that even he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "I think you might be exactly what I've been looking for." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the garage, something new was beginning. Neither Ethan nor Isabella could have known it then, but that moment, that handshake between two people from impossibly different worlds, would change everything. Not just for them, but for everyone their lives would touch in the days and years to come. The Rolls-Royce sat in the rain, waiting. And in a cluttered Detroit garage where dreams came to die, the first seeds of an impossible transformation were about to be planted. The handshake lingered a moment longer than business required, and in that extended contact, Ethan felt the weight of possibility pressing against his chest like a deep breath he couldn't quite release. Isabella's fingers were steady, but he caught the slight tremor that spoke of nerves beneath the executive composure, the kind of vulnerability that money couldn't armor against. "We should get your car inside before this storm gets any worse," Ethan said, releasing her hand and moving toward the garage door controls. The ancient motor groaned to life, pulling the heavy door upward with the mechanical symphony of gears and chains that had been music to his ears since childhood. "Will it fit?" Isabella asked, eyeing the narrow opening with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to calculating spatial relationships and risk factors. "She'll squeeze through. These old garages were built when cars were honest about their size." Ethan stepped into the rain, immediately soaked through his coveralls. "Mind if I drive her in? I like to get a feel for how an engine behaves before I start diagnosing." Isabella hesitated for just a heartbeat, the pause of someone who'd never handed their keys to a stranger, especially not one whose garage looked like it had survived both the Great Depression and the city's economic collapse through sheer stubbornness. But then she pressed the electronic fob into his palm, and the simple gesture felt like trust made tangible. The interior of the Rolls-Royce was a revelation. Ethan settled into leather so soft, it seemed to embrace him, surrounded by wood trim that gleamed like liquid amber and chrome accents that reflected his weathered face in perfect clarity. The dashboard was an elegant blend of traditional craftsmanship and cutting-edge technology, analog gauges, nestled alongside digital displays that probably contained more computing power than NASA had used to reach the moon. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his hands finding the steering wheel with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. He pressed the start button, and the engine came to life with the whispered authority of 12 perfectly balanced cylinders. For a moment, just a moment, it sounded flawless. The V12 purred with the contentment of mechanical precision, each combustion cycle timed with Swiss watch accuracy. But then Ethan heard a subtle irregularity in the rhythm, like a symphony orchestra, where the second violin was a fraction of a beat off tempo. "There you are," he murmured, his trained ear catching what $6,000 worth of diagnostic equipment had missed. "What's your story, beautiful?" He eased the Rolls-Royce forward, and it responded with the fluid grace of liquid mercury. The car moved into the garage with inches to spare on either side, fitting through the opening like it had been measured for the space. Through the windshield, he saw Isabella and Lila watching from the doorway, two generations of female intelligence studying his every movement. But as he settled the car into position and prepared to shut off the engine, the irregularity suddenly intensified. The smooth purr became a hesitant stutter power fluctuating like a heart-skipping beats. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the engine note dropped, wavered, and then died completely. Silence filled the garage like water rushing into a sinking ship. Well, Ethan said to himself, turning off the ignition and sitting for a moment in the sudden quiet. At least you're consistent. He climbed out of the driver's seat and found Isabella approaching with quick steps, her business heels clicking against the concrete floor. It died again, didn't it? I could hear it from here. Yes, ma'am. But that might be the best thing that could have happened. Isabella's eyebrows rose. How is a dead car the best thing? Because now I can hear exactly what she's trying to tell me. Ethan moved to the front of the Rolls-Royce and released the hood latches with the careful precision of someone who understood that every action had consequences. Lila, honey, would you grab my stethoscope from the tool chest? The good one, not the backup. Stethoscope. Isabella watched as Lila retrieved what looked like a medical instrument from a drawer full of precision tools. You're going to listen to my car's heartbeat. In a manner of speaking. Ethan accepted the automotive stethoscope from his daughter and held it up for Isabella to see. This little beauty has been with me for 20 years. It lets me hear things that computer diagnostics miss, the actual sounds of mechanical distress. The hood lifted to reveal an engine bay so clean and precisely arranged, it looked more like a jewelry display than automotive machinery. Every component was nestled in its designated space with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of engineering as art form. Chrome covers gleamed despite the Michigan weather, and rubber seals showed no signs of age or wear. Beautiful work, Ethan said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. This is what happens when money meets craftsmanship. No shortcuts, no compromises. Isabella moved closer, standing beside him as he began his examination. The factory specialist said the same thing. He was impressed by the build quality, which made it even more frustrating that he couldn't solve the problem. Ethan placed the stethoscope against various points on the engine block, his eyes closing as he concentrated on the subtle sounds that others might miss. To him, an engine was like a conversation between thousands of precisely machined parts, each component contributing its voice to a mechanical chorus. When everything worked properly, the result was harmony. When something went wrong, even the smallest flaw created discord that trained ears could identify. Tell me about the pattern, he said, moving the stethoscope to different locations. When does it happen? Hot weather, cold weather, city driving, highway driving, full tank, low tank. No pattern that anyone could identify. That's what made it so maddening. Isabella watched his methodical examination with growing interest. Sometimes it would run perfectly for days, then suddenly lose power in the middle of a meeting drive. Other times it would act up 3 times in one afternoon, then behave flawlessly for a week. Intermittent problems are the worst, Lila chimed in from her position by the parts counter where she'd resumed her homework, but kept one ear on the conversation. They're like ghost stories. Everyone knows something's wrong, but you can never prove it when you need to. Ethan smiled at his daughter's analogy. That's exactly right, kiddo. And this particular ghost has been pretty clever about hiding from some very smart people. He continued his examination, checking fuel lines, vacuum hoses, electrical connections, all the usual suspects in engine performance issues. Everything looked perfect, which only deepened the mystery. The previous mechanics had been thorough. He could see evidence of recent parts replacements, fresh gaskets, new filters. Someone had spent considerable time and money trying to solve this puzzle. Mr. Cole, Isabella's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you being so careful with everything? I mean, I appreciate the attention to detail, but the other mechanics dove right in with their computers and diagnostic tools. You're different. Ethan straightened up, considering how to explain something he'd never really put into words before. Ma'am, When you go to a doctor with a mysterious illness, what's the first thing they do? Take a medical history, I suppose. Ask about symptoms. Exactly. They don't just start cutting you open to see what's inside. They listen to what your body is telling them. He gestured toward the engine bay. This beauty is trying to communicate, but she's speaking in a language most people have forgotten how to understand. All those computers and diagnostic tools, they're like having a conversation through a translator who only speaks half the language. Isabella nodded slowly. So you're trying to hear what she's actually saying? That's the idea. Sometimes the most sophisticated problems have surprisingly simple solutions, but you have to be willing to listen past the noise. As if summoned by his words, the storm outside intensified, rain hammering against the garage roof with renewed fury. The sound created a cocoon of intimacy around their small group. The outside world reduced to the distant rumble of thunder and the steady percussion of water against metal. "Dad," Lila called from across the garage. "Mrs. Patterson called. She wants to know if her Buick will be ready tomorrow." "Tell her Wednesday," Ethan replied without looking up from his examination. "I want to make sure the brake work is perfect before she takes it home." Isabella watched the easy exchange between father and daughter with something that looked like wistfulness. "How long has she been helping you here?" "Since she was old enough to hold a wrench without dropping it. Her mother used to say Lila had motor oil in her veins instead of blood." The mention of Maria brought the familiar ache, but also warmth. She's got better diagnostic instincts than most mechanics with 20 years' experience. And she wants to study engineering. Mechanical engineering with a focus on sustainable energy systems. Lila answered for herself. "I want to figure out how to make traditional combustion engines work with renewable energy sources, like a bridge between what we have and what we need." Isabella's expression shifted, business interest sharpening her features. "That's remarkably prescient for someone your age. The automotive industry is desperately seeking solutions exactly like what you're describing." "I know," Lila said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of youth. "That's why I want to be part of the solution instead of just complaining about the problem." Ethan felt pride swell in his chest like a sunrise. His daughter had inherited Maria's brilliance and his mechanical intuition, creating a combination that could take her anywhere in the world. If only they could figure out how to afford sending her there. "Mr. Cole," Isabella's voice pulled him back to the present. "I'm curious about something. You mentioned earlier that you'd treat my car like it was your own. But what would you do if this were your car and you were facing the same problem?" The question stopped him cold. What would he do if he owned a car worth more than most people's houses, if he had the resources to take it to the best specialists in the world, if failure meant more than just professional embarrassment? "Honestly?" Ethan wiped his hands on a shop rag, considering the question put with the seriousness it deserved. "If this were my car, I'd probably have given up after the first specialist couldn't fix it. I'd have sold it for whatever I could get and bought something more reliable. But it's not my car, it's yours. And for some reason you haven't given up even though logic says you should have months ago. That tells me this isn't just about transportation." Isabella was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried layers of meaning Ethan was only beginning to understand. "This car was a gift to myself when I closed my first $100 million acquisition. I was 32 years old, the youngest person and only woman on my company's board of directors. Everyone said I was too young, too inexperienced, too everything that wasn't what they expected." She moved closer to the Rolls-Royce, her hand resting on the pristine silver paint. "When I drove this car off the lot, I felt like I'd finally proven something to the world. And to myself. And now it feels like everything I've worked for is breaking down, and I can't fix it no matter how much money I throw at the problem." Isabella's laugh was bitter as old coffee. Maybe that's too much psychology to load onto a mechanical issue. Ethan understood. He'd felt the same way watching his garage struggle, watching his customers drift away to chain stores and suburban dealers. Sometimes mechanical problems became metaphors for everything else falling apart in your life. "Ma'am, I've got a theory about cars and the people who drive them. Would you like to hear it? Please." "I think cars choose their owners as much as owners choose their cars. This Rolls-Royce picked you for a reason, and now she's testing whether you're worthy of the relationship." Ethan's hand joined hers on the hood, calloused fingers, manicured nails. Those other mechanics tried to fix her with force, replacing parts, running diagnostics, treating symptoms instead of causes. But maybe what she really needs is someone who understands that the most important repairs happen between the machine and the person who depends on it. Thunder rolled across the Detroit sky like the voice of judgment itself, and in its wake the garage fell into contemplative silence. Lila looked up from her homework, with the expression of someone watching adults navigate emotional territory she recognized but couldn't yet name. "That's either very wise or very crazy," Isabella said softly. "Like I said before, the two aren't mutually exclusive." Ethan returned to his examination this time, focusing on components the previous mechanics might have overlooked. Not the obvious suspects like fuel pumps and ignition systems, but the subtle elements that could cause intermittent problems. He checked ground connections, examined wire harnesses for signs of chafing, tested vacuum lines for microscopic leaks that might not show up on pressure tests. "Can I ask you something else?" Isabella moved to watch his technique more closely. "What made you become a mechanic? I mean, what drew you to this work specifically?" The question touched something deep in Ethan's memory, places he rarely visited anymore. "My father. He ran a garage a lot like this one back when Detroit was still the Motor City, and everyone believed the good times would last forever. I used to spend summers here learning that every machine has a personality, that fixing things matters more than just making money. And your father taught you to listen to engines. Among other things, he used to say that mechanics were like doctors for machines. Our job wasn't just to fix problems, but to understand what caused them in the first place. Prevention was always better than cure." Isabella absorbed this, her business mind clearly working through implications Ethan couldn't guess at. "What happened to your father's garage?" "Same thing that happened to most of them. Chain stores, suburban sprawl, the economy changing faster than small businesses could adapt." Ethan's voice carried old grief, the kind that comes from watching something you love disappear piece by piece. He held on longer than most, but eventually the numbers just didn't work anymore. "Is that what's happening here?" The question hung in the air like exhaust smoke, visible and impossible to ignore. Ethan could have lied, could have painted a rosier picture of his situation, but something about Isabella Grant invited honesty. "Yeah," he said simply. "It is. Dad's too proud to admit it," Lila added from across the garage. "But we're probably going to lose this place in the next 6 months. Maybe sooner if something major goes wrong." "Lila, it's true, Dad. And Ms. Grant seems like someone who appreciates straight answers." Isabella looked between father and daughter, seeing the dynamic that had developed between them. The child forced to grow up too quickly, the parent trying to shield her from adult realities while depending on her maturity to survive them. "What would it take to keep the garage running?" Isabella asked. Ethan straightened up, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Ma'am, I appreciate the concern, but I didn't tell you about our situation to ask for charity. I told you because you asked an honest question and deserved an honest answer." "I understand, But I'm a businesswoman, Mr. Cole. When I see value being wasted, whether it's an underperforming company or a mechanic with skills that money can't buy, I start thinking about solutions. What kind of solutions? Before Isabella could answer, the garage was suddenly illuminated by a brilliant flash of lightning, followed immediately by thunder so close it seemed to shake the building's foundation. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the ghost light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. "Well," Ethan said into the sudden quiet, "that's one way to end a diagnostic session. Emergency lighting should kick in." Lila's voice came from across the garage, followed by the sound of her moving through familiar darkness. "Dad installed backup power after the last big storm." Sure enough, battery-powered LED panels began glowing to life, casting the garage in stark white light that made everything look like a photograph from a crime scene. The Rolls-Royce sat in the center of it all, its silver paint gleaming like trapped moonlight. "This happens often?" Isabella asked. "Often enough that we're prepared for it," Ethan replied. "Detroit's power grid isn't exactly state-of-the-art. We've got maybe 4 hours of backup power, then we're down until the utility company gets around to fixing whatever broke." Isabella pulled out her phone, its screen glowing blue in the emergency lighting. "I should probably call for a ride. My driver is expecting." "Ma'am, with respect, you're not going anywhere in this storm. Even if you could get a car service to come out to this neighborhood, which is unlikely, the streets are probably flooded by now." As if to punctuate his point, another crash of thunder shook the building, and the rain intensified to a level that made conversation difficult. Through the windows, they could see water flowing down the street, like a river carrying debris and the dreams of a city that had learned to endure whatever nature threw at it. "I suppose I'm stranded," Isabella said, but she didn't sound particularly distressed by the prospect. "We've got coffee," Lila offered. "And Dad keeps emergency supplies in the back office. You're welcome to wait out the storm here." Isabella looked around the garage with new eyes, seeing it not as a temporary refuge, but as a glimpse into a world she'd never experienced. The emergency lighting cast everything in sharp relief, the organized chaos of spare parts, the tools that showed decades of careful use, the evidence of a life built around making broken things whole again. "Thank you," she said. "I'd like that." Ethan moved toward the small office area at the back of the garage, where a camping stove and emergency supplies waited for exactly this kind of situation. "Hope you don't mind instant coffee. It's not exactly what you're probably used to." "Mr. Cole, right now, instant coffee sounds perfect." As he busied himself with the simple ritual of making coffee in the emergency lighting, Ethan found himself stealing glances at their unexpected guest. Isabella Grant had settled into a folding chair near Lila's homework station, and the two of them were discussing something that involved sketches and mathematical equations. Despite the expensive clothes and obvious wealth, she seemed genuinely interested in his daughter's projects. "Is this your design for the hybrid adaptation system?" Isabella was asking, leaning forward to study Lila's notebook. "Just preliminary concepts," Lila replied with the modesty of someone who didn't yet understand how rare her insights were. "I'm trying to figure out how to integrate regenerative braking with traditional combustion engines without compromising performance." "And you're doing this research on your own?" "Dad helps when I get stuck on the mechanical parts, but most of it is just reading everything I can find online and working through the problems myself." Isabella looked up as Ethan approached with 3 steaming cups of coffee. "Your daughter is remarkable, Mr. Cole. The concepts she's developing could revolutionize how we think about automotive efficiency." Ethan handed her a cup, noting how she accepted it, with both hands, a gesture that seemed more grateful than polite. "She gets that from her mother. Maria was the smartest person I ever knew. PhD in engineering from Michigan, could have worked anywhere in the world." "What did she choose to do instead?" taught high school physics in the inner city, said that's where the next generation of innovators was waiting if someone would just show them what was possible. The coffee was terrible, bitter, and thin, and nothing like what Isabella Grant probably drank in her corporate boardroom, but she sipped it with apparent appreciation. She sounds like an exceptional woman. She was. Cancer took her 2 years ago, but she made sure Lila understood that intelligence is a responsibility, not just a gift. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside the garage something warmer was building. 3 people from completely different worlds, brought together by mechanical failure and meteorological chaos, discovering that human connection could bridge gaps that money and education couldn't. "Mr. Cole," Isabella said eventually, "earlier you asked what I would do if this were my car, and I was facing the same problem. Can I turn that question around? How so? If you were in my position, if you had resources but not expertise, if you could hire anyone you wanted but couldn't solve the problem yourself, what would you do?" Ethan considered the question while listening to the rain and watching his daughter work through engineering problems that would challenge graduate students. "I guess I'd try to find someone who thought differently than everyone else I'd hired. Someone who might see what I'd been missing. And if that person happened to work in a failing garage in a forgotten neighborhood, then I'd probably have to swallow my pride and admit that expertise doesn't always come with fancy credentials." Isabella smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her. "That's exactly what I'm doing, Mr. Cole. And tomorrow, when the storm passes and the power comes back on, I'd like to see what you can discover that 5 specialists couldn't." Lightning flickered again, painting the garage in stark black and white, and in that brief illumination, Ethan saw the future hovering just beyond his understanding. Not just the mechanical puzzle of a broken Rolls-Royce, but something larger, an opportunity that could change everything for him and Lila if he was brave enough to reach for it. The storm raged on, but inside the garage, 3 unlikely companions settled in to wait for dawn, each carrying hopes they hadn't dared voice and dreams they were only beginning to understand. The coffee had grown cold in their cups by the time the storm began to subside, its fury gradually diminishing to the steady rhythm of ordinary rain. Dawn crept through the garage windows like a cautious visitor, painting everything in shades of gray and silver that made the Rolls-Royce look more like a mirage than a machine. Ethan had spent the night dozing fitfully in his desk chair, waking periodically to check on his guests. Isabella had curled up on the small couch in the office area, her expensive suit wrinkled, but her dignity intact. Lila had claimed the sleeping bag they kept for emergencies, spreading it near her homework station, where she could keep working on her engineering sketches, even in the dim emergency lighting. "Good morning." Isabella's voice cut through the dawn, quiet, hoarse from sleep, but carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to early meetings and urgent decisions. "Morning, ma'am." Ethan stretched, feeling every one of his 47 years in his joints and lower back. "Storm's passed. Power should be back on soon." As if summoned by his words, the overhead fluorescents flickered to life, flooding the garage with harsh white light that made them all blink and squint. The emergency LEDs automatically shut off, and the familiar hum of electrical equipment filled the space, the coffee maker gurgling to life, the computer terminal booting up the diagnostic equipment running through its startup sequences. "Now we can get to work," Ethan said, moving toward the Rolls-Royce with renewed purpose. The morning light revealed details he'd missed in the storm, and emergency lighting, subtle variations in the engine bay's appearance that spoke of recent maintenance and careful attention. Isabella stood and smoothed her wrinkled suit, transforming herself back into the executive who commanded boardrooms and million-dollar decisions. But something had changed during the night, some barrier had been lowered. She moved toward the car with genuine curiosity rather than the desperate frustration she'd carried the evening before. "Where do you want to start?" she asked. With what everyone else missed. Ethan opened the hood and studied the engine bay in the full light of day. Lila, would you fire up the diagnostic computer? I want to see what codes this beauty is throwing. His daughter moved to the computer terminal with practiced efficiency, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up around automotive technology. Dad, we don't have the Rolls-Royce specific software. The generic OBD Tumptusu scanner might not catch everything. That's fine, kiddo. Sometimes the generic codes tell you more than the fancy proprietary ones. They show you what the engine thinks is wrong, not what the manufacturer thinks you should fix. Isabella watched the interaction with growing interest. You really think there's a difference? Oh, there's definitely a difference. Ethan connected the diagnostic scanner to the port. Under the dashboard, its cable snaking through the luxury interior like a lifeline between worlds. Proprietary diagnostic systems are designed to sell parts and authorized service. Generic systems just report what the sensors are actually detecting. The computer screen filled with data engine parameters, sensor readings, fault codes that told the story of a machine in distress. But it wasn't the codes that caught Ethan's attention. It was the patterns in the data, the subtle irregularities that spoke of something the previous mechanics had overlooked. Interesting, he murmured, scrolling through screens of information. What is it? Isabella moved closer, trying to decipher the technical readouts. Your fuel pressure is perfect. Ignition timing is spot on. Air-fuel mixture is exactly where it should be. According to these readings, your engine should be running like a Swiss watch. But it's not. No, it's not. Which tells me the problem isn't with any of the systems everyone else tested. Ethan's eyes brightened with the excitement of a puzzle solver who'd found the crucial clue. Lila, pull up the historical data. I want to see what the sensors recorded during the previous failure events. His daughter's fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up data logs that painted a picture of mechanical distress. Dad, look at this. The failures always happen when the engine is under load acceleration, climbing hills, merging onto highways. But the weird thing is, all the major systems show normal parameters right up until the moment it dies. Isabella studied the data over Lila's shoulder. What does that suggest? It suggests we're dealing with something that only fails under specific conditions. Ethan said, his mind racing through possibilities. Something that works fine when the engine is idling or running at steady speeds, but can't handle the stress of real-world driving. He moved back to the engine bay, this time looking not at the obvious components, but at the connections between them. Modern engines were marvels of integration, thousands of parts working together with precision that would make a symphony conductor weep with envy. But that integration also meant that a single failing component could cascade into system-wide problems. Tell me about the last time it worked perfectly, Ethan said, his hands exploring the engine bay with the gentle thoroughness of a physician examining a patient. Isabella thought back through months of frustration. 3 weeks ago, driving to a board meeting in Grand Rapids. Perfect acceleration, smooth power delivery, no hesitation or irregular behavior. I actually thought the problem had finally been solved. What happened between that drive and the next failure? I had a meeting that ran late, so the car sat in an underground parking garage for about 6 hours. When I came out, it started fine but died completely about 10 miles down the highway. Ethan's hands stilled on a particular section of the engine bay. Underground parking garage. Climate controlled. Yes, why? What was the weather like that day? Isabella's brow furrowed as she tried to remember details that had seemed irrelevant at the time. Hot. Very hot. It was one of those August days where the heat shimmers off the pavement. And the garage was cool. Yes, probably 20 degrees cooler than outside. Ethan's pulse quickened with the thrill of discovery. He'd found something, a thread that might unravel the entire mystery. His hands moved to a cluster of sensors and wiring harnesses nestled deep in the engine bay components that would be affected by temperature changes, but might not show up on standard diagnostic tests. "Lila, honey, hand me the thermal imaging camera." "We don't have a thermal imaging camera, Dad." "Right." Ethan laughed at himself momentarily, forgetting the limitations of his equipment compared to the high-tech shops Isabella had visited. "But we don't need one. Sometimes old-fashioned detective work beats fancy gadgets." He pulled out a small mirror on a telescoping handle, the kind dentists use to examine hard-to-reach places. Angling it to catch the morning light, he explored the deepest recesses of the engine bay, looking for signs of heat damage or thermal stress that might not be visible from above. "What exactly are you looking for?" Isabella asked. "Evidence. Heat leaves footprints if you know how to read them. Discolored metal, brittle rubber connections that look different from their neighbors." Ethan's mirror caught something that made him pause. "Well, hello there. What is it?" "Hand me the inspection light, Lila. The LED one with the flexible neck." The bright light revealed what the mirror had suggested, a section of wiring harness that looked subtly different from the surrounding components. The protective covering was slightly discolored, and one of the connector blocks showed signs of thermal stress that spoke of heat cycling and expansion stress. "There's our ghost," Ethan said with quiet satisfaction. Isabella leaned closer, trying to see what he was seeing. "What am I looking at?" "A wiring harness that's been cooking itself to death every time the engine gets hot and the ambient temperature changes rapidly." Ethan traced the path of the affected wires with his finger. "This harness carries signals from several critical sensors: throttle position, mass, airflow, manifold pressure. When it's working properly, your engine runs perfectly. When the heat stress causes intermittent connections, the engine computer gets conflicting signals and shuts everything down to protect itself." "But why didn't the other mechanics find this?" "Because they were looking for failed components, not failing connections. Their diagnostic tests probably showed all the sensors working correctly because they tested them under controlled conditions in climate-controlled shops. The problem only shows up when the wiring is stressed by heat cycling, hot engine bay, cool ambient air, rapid temperature changes." Lila looked up from the computer terminal where she'd been following the diagnostic data. "Dad, that makes perfect sense. Look at the failure pattern. It always happens during transitions. Hot day to cool parking garage, cold morning warm-up, stop-and-go traffic where the engine temperature fluctuates." Isabella stared at the innocent-looking wiring harness that had caused months of frustration and thousands of dollars in unnecessary repairs. "You're telling me that my car has been breaking down because of a few wires that don't like temperature changes?" "It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially, yes." Ethan straightened up, wiping his hands on a shop rag with the satisfaction of a job well diagnosed. The previous mechanics weren't wrong about the symptoms they found. They just treated the symptoms instead of finding the cause. "Can you fix it?" Ethan studied the affected harness, calculating what would be needed to solve the problem permanently. "I can do better than fix it. I can make sure it never happens again." "How?" "By replacing this entire harness section with upgraded components designed for better heat resistance, and by adding some thermal protection that should have been there from the factory." Ethan's mind was already working through the solution, seeing not just the immediate repair, but the engineering improvements that would prevent future problems. "It's not a complicated fix, but it requires understanding what actually went wrong instead of just swapping parts until something works." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what she'd just learned. 6 months of frustration, 5 different specialists, tens of thousands of dollars in diagnostic fees and parts replacement, all because no one had looked beyond the obvious answers to find the real problem. "How long will it take?" she asked. "Couple of hours for the actual repair. But I'll need to order the right components. The upgraded harness isn't something I keep in stock, and I want to use military-spec heat shielding for the thermal protection." Cost. Ethan did quick mental calculations. Parts and labor may be $300, $400 at the outside. Isabella's laugh was sharp with irony. $300. I've spent more than that on diagnostic fees alone at each shop I visited. Ma'am, the expensive part wasn't the repair. It was figuring out what needed repairing. And you figured it out in one night. I had advantages the others didn't. Such as... Ethan gestured around the garage, taking in the organized chaos of his life's work. Time to really listen to what your car was trying to tell me. No pressure to move on to the next customer. No corporate protocols about approved diagnostic procedures. Just me, your engine, and 40 years of experience with machines that break in interesting ways. Isabella moved toward the office area where fresh coffee was brewing the morning ritual that transformed instant fuel into something approaching civilization. "Mr. Cole, can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "What are you going to do when this garage closes? You have skills that are clearly valuable knowledge that money can't buy. Surely there are opportunities to work for someone else, to be an employee instead of a business owner." Ethan accepted the coffee cup Lila offered him, inhaling the aroma that spoke of mornings and possibilities. "I've thought about it. There's a Ford dealership in the suburbs that's offered me a job. Good pay, benefits, steady hours. But you haven't taken it. Because it would mean giving up everything I've built here. This garage isn't just a business, Ms. Grant. It's a connection to my father, to my wife, to the community that supported us through good times and bad. Working at a dealership would mean following someone else's procedures, using someone else's judgment about what matters and what doesn't." Isabella sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "I understand that. I've built my own company from nothing, watched it grow from a one-room office to a corporation with facilities in 12 states. The idea of giving up that independence, that connection to something you've created, it's terrifying." "What kind of company?" Lila asked from her position at the computer, where she was studying the diagnostic data with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. "Industrial automation and sustainable manufacturing systems. We help companies modernize their production processes to be more efficient and environmentally responsible." Ethan's interest sharpened. "That sounds like the kind of work that could use someone who understands both traditional mechanical systems and new technology." It absolutely could. In fact, that's one of our biggest challenges, finding people who can bridge the gap between old-school mechanical knowledge and cutting-edge automation. Most engineers understand theory, but have never actually fixed anything with their hands. Most mechanics understand machines, but don't have the technical education to work with modern systems. Like hybrid combustion electric integration. Lila looked up from her work with sudden interest. Exactly like that. We're working with several automotive manufacturers on next-generation efficiency systems, but we keep running into the same problem. The people who understand internal combustion engines don't understand electric systems, and the people who understand electric systems have never worked on traditional engines. Isabella paused her coffee cup halfway to her lips as an idea began forming in her mind. "Mr. Cole, what would you say if I told you there might be another option? Something that would let you keep your independence while using your skills on a larger scale?" "I'd say that sounds too good to be true, which means I should be skeptical." Smart answer, but hear me out. Isabella set down her cup and moved toward the Rolls-Royce, her hand resting on the hood as if the car itself was part of her proposal. "My company is developing a new division focused on automotive sustainability, helping manufacturers transition existing production lines to build hybrid and electric vehicles. We need someone who understands traditional automotive systems inside and out, someone who can teach our engineers what they don't know about how cars actually work in the real world. Ethan felt something stirring in his chest, a combination of hope and terror that he recognized as opportunity knocking with brass knuckles. What kind of someone? A technical director, someone who would split their time between hands-on problem-solving and strategic consulting. Someone who could look at a manufacturing process and see not just what's broken, but what could be improved. And this someone would work initially from wherever they wanted. Eventually, we'd probably want to build a dedicated facility, a research and development center focused on practical applications of sustainable automotive technology. Lila looked up from her computer screen with eyes that held her mother's intelligence and her father's mechanical intuition. "Ms. Grant, are you offering Dad a job?" Isabella's smile was warm but careful. "I'm offering your father an opportunity to solve problems on a scale that could affect millions of vehicles instead of dozens. To use his knowledge to help transform an entire industry instead of just keeping individual cars running." The garage fell silent except for the steady hum of electrical equipment and the distant sound of Detroit beginning its daily struggle with survival and hope. Ethan stared at the Rolls-Royce, seeing not just a machine that needed repair, but a symbol of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "What would something like that pay?" he asked quietly. Isabella named a figure that made Ethan's coffee cup tremble in his hands. It was more than he'd made in the last 3 years, combined more than enough to secure Lila's education and their future, more than he'd ever dreamed of earning with grease under his fingernails and motor oil in his veins. "That's assuming you're interested," Isabella added quickly. "I know it would be a big change, a completely different kind of life." "Dad," Lila's voice was soft but urgent, "that's enough money for MIT. Enough for everything we've been worried about." Ethan set down his coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "Miss Grant, yesterday I was trying to figure out how to pay the power bill. Today, you're offering me a chance to join a company worth more than this entire neighborhood. Forgive me if I'm having trouble processing the transition. I understand it's overwhelming. But Mr. Cole, what you did this morning, finding a problem that 5 specialists missed, understanding the real cause instead of just treating symptoms, that's exactly the kind of thinking my industry desperately needs. You don't just fix machines. You understand them in ways that can't be taught in engineering schools." And if I said yes, what would that look like? Initially consulting work on specific problems. Projects you could handle from here while you decided whether you wanted to make a bigger commitment. We'd start with a 6-month contract, let you get a feel for the work and the company culture. Isabella moved closer, her business instincts engaged, but tempered with something that looked like genuine respect. "The goal wouldn't be to change who you are, Mr. Cole. It would be to give you resources to do what you already do, just on a larger scale with better tools and wider impact." Ethan looked around his garage, seeing it through new eyes. The organized chaos of spare parts, the tools that had served 3 generations of mechanics, the evidence of a life spent making broken things whole again. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was his, built with his hands, sustained by his reputation, connected to everything he valued about work and family and community. "I'd need time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course, but in the meantime, why don't we see if you can actually fix my car? Consider it an audition for both of us." The challenge hung in the air like the scent of possibility and motor oil. Ethan looked at the Rolls-Royce, then at his daughter, who was watching him with eyes that held faith and fear in equal measure. Finally, he looked at Isabella Grant, the woman who had arrived in the storm as a customer, and somehow become something approaching salvation. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves with the deliberate motion of a man preparing to change his life. "Let's see if I can earn that confidence." The morning sun streamed through the garage windows, painting everything in the golden light of new beginnings. Ethan Cole reached for his tools, not knowing that the next few hours would determine not just whether a luxury car would run again, but whether a struggling mechanic and his brilliant daughter would finally find their way out of the shadows and into a future neither of them had dared to dream. The Rolls-Royce waited patient as a sphinx ready to reveal whether miracles could still happen in forgotten corners of the American dream. The tools felt different in Ethan's hands that morning, weighted with possibility rather than just necessity. He selected his instruments with the careful deliberation of a surgeon preparing for a life-changing operation, each wrench and socket chosen not just for function, but for the precision required to prove himself worthy of the future Isabella Grant had dangled before him. "The first thing we need to do is isolate the affected section," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had finally found solid ground after months of sinking. "Lila, can you pull up the wiring schematics on the computer? I want to make sure I understand every connection before we start cutting into anything." His daughter's fingers danced across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Dad, I can't find Rolls-Royce specific diagrams, but I can cross-reference with similar BMW systems. They share a lot of components." "That'll work. Sometimes generic information is more useful than proprietary data anyway." Ethan moved closer to study the screen, aware that Isabella was watching every movement, every decision, evaluating his methods against the specialists who had failed before him. The schematic revealed what his hands had already suspected. The failing harness was part of a complex network that controlled multiple engine systems simultaneously. It wasn't just a simple wire replacement. It was automotive surgery that required understanding how each component communicated with the others. "This is why the problem was so hard to diagnose," Ethan explained, tracing the connections with his finger. "This harness carries signals for throttle position, mass airflow, manifold pressure, and oxygen sensors. When the connections become intermittent, the engine computer gets contradictory information and doesn't know which sensors to trust." Isabella leaned closer, her expensive perfume mixing with the honest scents of motor oil and metal. "So it shuts everything down rather than risk damage." "Exactly. It's actually a very sophisticated safety system. The problem is, if you don't understand what's causing the sensor conflicts, you end up chasing ghost problems that seem to appear and disappear randomly." Ethan began disconnecting the battery, the first step in any electrical repair that demanded absolute precision. The previous mechanics weren't incompetent, Ms. Grant. They were working with incomplete information and time pressures that forced them to make educated guesses instead of taking time to understand the real problem. "And you have that time?" "Right now I do. Your car is the most important thing in my garage, and solving this puzzle correctly matters more than moving on to the next job." He paused in his work to look directly at her. "That's not always a luxury I can afford, but today it is." The morning wore on with the methodical rhythm of careful work. Ethan removed components with surgical precision, creating clear paths to access the damaged wiring, while documenting each step with photographs that would guide reassembly. Isabella watched with growing fascination as the engine bay transformed from mysterious complexity to organized logic under his hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said, as he worked to free a particularly stubborn connector. "Shoot." "How do you know which parts to remove and which ones to leave alone? To me, everything looks equally important." Ethan smiled, remembering the same confusion from his early days learning under his father's patient guidance. "It's like taking apart a watch. Every piece has a purpose, but some are structural and some are functional. The trick is understanding which systems depend on each other and working backwards from the problem to find the safest path. And if you guess wrong, then you create new problems while trying to solve old ones. That's why patience matters more than speed in this kind of work. He freed the stubborn connector with a satisfying click. Rushing leads to broken clips, damaged threads, connections that never quite fit right again. Lila looked up from her position at the computer, where she'd been researching upgrade options for the replacement harness. Dad, I found military specification wire that's rated for temperature extremes twice what this car will ever see. It costs more, but it should eliminate any possibility of heat damage. How much more? About $60 difference. Ethan glanced at Isabella, who nodded without hesitation. Use the military spec. If we're going to fix this problem, let's fix it permanently. The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. This wasn't just about automotive repair. It was about philosophy, about the difference between doing something adequately and doing it right. Ethan felt a surge of respect for Isabella Grant that had nothing to do with her wealth and everything to do with her understanding of what quality actually meant. I like the way you think, Ms. Grant. Isabella, please. I think we're past formal titles at this point. The use of her first name felt like crossing a threshold, moving from professional distance to something approaching partnership. Ethan continued his work with renewed focus, aware that he was being evaluated not just as a mechanic, but as someone who might help shape the future of an entire industry. Tell me about your company, he said, as he worked to expose the full extent of the damaged wiring. How did you get into industrial automation? Isabella settled into a folding chair, her posture relaxing, as she moved from observer to conversationalist. I started as a manufacturing engineer for General Motors, back when they were trying to figure out how to compete with Japanese efficiency. I spent 5 years on assembly lines learning how cars are actually built rather than just designed. That's unusual. Most executives I've met have never been on a factory floor. Which is exactly the problem. You can't improve what you don't understand, and you can't understand manufacturing by reading reports in a boardroom. Isabella's voice carried the passion of someone who had found her calling in the intersection of theory and practice. I left GM to start my own consulting firm, helping companies bridge the gap between engineering theory and production reality. And it worked. Better than I expected. Turns out there's huge demand for someone who can translate between the people who design systems and the people who have to build them. She paused, watching Ethan's methodical approach to the wiring problem. That's what I see in what you're doing right now, the ability to understand not just what's broken, but why it broke and how to prevent it from breaking again. Ethan felt heat in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the work. Praise from someone of Isabella's caliber wasn't something he'd experienced often, and it touched something deep in his professional pride that he'd almost forgotten existed. I just try to listen to what the machine is telling me. That's a rare skill in my industry. Most people are so focused on data and computer models that they forget machines exist in the real world, where temperature changes and vibration and human error affect everything. Lila looked up from her research with sudden excitement. Isabella, your company works on hybrid systems, right? I've been thinking about Dad's diagnostic approach, and it seems like it would be perfect for troubleshooting integration problems between electric and combustion systems. Isabella's attention sharpened with business interest. Explain what you mean. Well, most diagnostic systems treat electric and combustion components separately, but in a hybrid, they have to work together seamlessly. If you had someone who understood both systems at a fundamental level, who could listen to the interaction between them, you could diagnose problems that don't show up in either system individually. Isabella's voice carried the excitement of someone recognizing a solution to a problem she'd been struggling with. Lila, that's brilliant. We've been trying to solve exactly that challenge for 2 years. Ethan paused in his work, suddenly aware that his 12-year-old daughter was casually discussing solutions to million-dollar engineering problems. Kiddo, what exactly have you been reading? Everything I can find about automotive systems integration. There's this whole field of research into hybrid efficiency optimization that most people ignore because it requires understanding both electrical and mechanical engineering. Isabella stared at Lila with the expression of someone who had just discovered a diamond in a coal mine. Lila, the concepts you're describing represent some of the most advanced thinking in automotive engineering. Companies spend millions trying to solve these integration challenges. I know. That's why I want to study at MIT, but also why I think Dad's approach could revolutionize the field. Your daughter, Isabella said to Ethan, is going to change the world. If we can figure out how to pay for her education. When we figure out how to pay for it, Isabella corrected gently. This conversation is making me even more convinced that both of you belong in my organization. Ethan returned to his work, but his mind was racing with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. The damaged wiring harness was yielding to his patient approach, revealing the full extent of the thermal damage that had frustrated 5 previous mechanics. But more than that, it was revealing the path forward, not just for this repair, but for his entire future. The damage is worse than I initially thought, he said, exposing a section of wire where the insulation had become brittle and cracked. But it's also more localized. We can replace just this section instead of the entire harness, which will save time and ensure the repair integrates properly with the original systems. How long for the actual replacement? Ethan studied the exposed wiring, calculating not just the mechanical work, but the precision required to make connections that would last for the life of the vehicle. 3 hours for the replacement, another hour for testing and verification. I want to simulate the temperature cycling that caused the original failure to make sure our repair holds up. You can do that here, not with fancy equipment, but with careful observation and practical testing. Sometimes the best diagnostic tool is time and patience. Isabella checked her watch, a gesture that reminded Ethan she had a life and responsibilities beyond his garage. I should make some calls, let my office know I'll be delayed. Do you mind if I use your office space? Of course. Though I should warn you, the coffee is still terrible. After last night, I'm starting to develop a taste for it. As Isabella moved toward the office area to handle her business calls, Ethan found himself alone with Lila and the Rolls-Royce, surrounded by the familiar comfort of mechanical challenge and his daughter's brilliant curiosity. Dad, Lila said quietly, are you going to take her offer? The question hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial and capable of changing everything. Ethan continued working on the wiring harness, using the familiar rhythm of careful repair to think through implications that stretched far beyond automotive electronics. What do you think I should do, kiddo? I think you should be scared, but I also think you should do it. Why? Lila set down her pencil and looked at him with eyes that held her mother's wisdom and his own mechanical intuition. Because Mom always said that the biggest risk isn't trying and failing. It's not trying at all and spending your whole life wondering what could have been. The words hit Ethan like a perfectly timed wrench to the chest. Maria had said exactly that on countless occasions when he'd been too cautious, too afraid of failure to reach for opportunities that might have changed their lives. She also said that you were the smartest person she'd ever met when it came to understanding how things work, Lila continued. Not just machines, Dad. Systems, people, the way everything connects to everything else. And you think Isabella's company is where I belong? I think Isabella's company is lucky to have found you. But more than that, I think it's where you could do the most good. How many cars could you help if you weren't just fixing them one at a time, but helping design systems that work better from the beginning? From the office area came the sound of Isabella's voice, professional and authoritative, as she handled whatever crisis required her attention. Ethan could hear fragments of conversation about production schedules and efficiency metrics, the language of an industry that juiced mountains of metal and rivers of money to keep America mobile. There's something else, Lila said, lowering her voice even further. I've been researching MIT's automotive engineering program. They have partnerships with companies like Isabella's. Students get to work on real projects, solve actual problems instead of just studying theory. Meaning if you joined her company, I might be able to contribute to projects even while I'm still in school. We could work together, Dad, on things that actually matter. The possibility took Ethan's breath away. Working alongside his daughter, combining his practical experience with her theoretical brilliance, contributing to solutions that could affect millions of vehicles instead of dozens. It was everything he'd never dared to dream. But what about the garage? What about the community that depends on us? Lila gestured toward the window where the morning sun was revealing the full extent of the neighborhood's decline. Boarded storefronts, empty lots where houses used to stand, the quiet desperation of a community that had been forgotten by progress. Dad, we're not helping the community by going down with the ship. But if you could help create jobs, develop technology that makes cars more affordable and efficient, work with companies to build facilities in places like Detroit. She didn't need to finish the thought. Ethan could see the vision she was painting, not abandoning the community that had supported him, but finding ways to bring opportunity back to places that had been written off by the larger economy. Isabella's voice grew closer as she finished her call and returned to the garage area. Sorry about that. Crisis in the Cleveland facility that required immediate attention. Everything okay? Ethan asked. Just the usual challenges of coordinating between engineering theory and manufacturing reality. Exactly the kind of problem someone with your skill set could help solve. The subtle pressure of the sales pitch wasn't lost on Ethan, but it didn't feel manipulative. Isabella Grant was offering him something real, something that could transform not just his life, but his ability to contribute to solutions that mattered. The wiring replacement should be ready to install by this afternoon, he said, returning focus to the immediate challenge. But I want to talk about something while we're waiting. What's that? Your offer. I'm interested, but I need to understand what success looks like from your perspective. What would you need to see from me to consider this partnership worthwhile? Isabella's smile was warm but businesslike. Honest answer, I need someone who can think differently than the engineers I already have. Someone who can look at a production problem and see solutions that don't come from textbooks or computer models. And if I can't deliver that, then we part as friends and you keep the consulting fees for the work you did help with. But Mr. Cole, Ethan, I don't think that's going to be an issue. She moved closer to the Rolls-Royce, her hand resting on the fender with the familiarity of ownership. This morning you solved a problem that cost me months of frustration and thousands of dollars. You did it not because you had better equipment or more credentials than the other mechanics, but because you approached the challenge differently. I just listened to what the car was trying to tell me. Exactly. And that's what I need someone to do with manufacturing systems, production. Challenges, integration problems that my current team can't solve because they're too focused on doing things the way they've always been done. Ethan felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar tool belt. The choice wasn't just about money or opportunity. It was about identity, about whether he was willing to step beyond the comfortable boundaries of what he'd always been to become something he wasn't sure he could handle. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "We could start with consulting work immediately. Project-based assignments that you could handle from here while you decide whether you want to make a bigger commitment. And if I decide I want that bigger commitment," Isabella's eyes brightened with the excitement of someone who had found exactly what she'd been searching for. "Then we build something together. A research and development facility focused on practical applications of sustainable automotive technology. A place where theoretical engineers can learn from hands-on mechanics and where real-world problems get solved by people who understand both the science and the craft." The vision was so compelling, so perfectly aligned with everything Ethan valued about work and innovation and solving problems that mattered, that he felt his resistance crumbling like old insulation in overheated wire. "There's one condition," he said quietly. "Name it. Lila gets to be part of this, not just as my daughter, but as a contributor. Her insights about hybrid systems integration could be valuable, and she needs real-world experience to complement her theoretical education." Isabella looked at Lila, who was pretending to focus on her computer screen, while obviously listening to every word of the conversation. "Lila," Isabella said, "how would you feel about spending summers working on automotive sustainability projects, learning about manufacturing systems, contributing to research that could affect the next generation of vehicles?" Lila's attempt at casual disinterest crumbled completely. "Are you serious? That would be amazing. I could work on actual hybrid integration problems, maybe even publish research papers before I graduate high school." "Consider it part of the package," Isabella said to Ethan. "Assuming, of course, that you're willing to take a leap of faith with someone you met less than 24 hours ago." Ethan looked around his garage one more time, seeing it not as a refuge from the world, but as a launching pad toward possibilities he was finally brave enough to reach for. The Rolls-Royce sat waiting for its repair, but it had already served its most important function, bringing together three people whose combined talents could create something extraordinary. "Isabella," he said, extending his hand with the firm grip of someone making a commitment that would change everything. "I think it's time to fix more than just your car." The handshake sealed more than just a business agreement. It marked the beginning of a partnership that would transform not just their individual lives, but their understanding of what was possible when practical wisdom met visionary thinking, when mechanical intuition combined with engineering brilliance, when the courage to dream big enough to change the world finally found the tools and opportunity to make those dreams reality. The handshake lingered with the weight of transformation, but the Rolls-Royce still needed fixing. Ethan released Isabella's hand and turned back to the engine bay with renewed purpose, his movements now carrying the confidence of a man who had found his path forward through the maze of uncertainty that had defined his life for too long. "First things first," he said, selecting tools with the precision of a surgeon. "Let's prove this theory works before we start planning the future." The afternoon sun streamed through the garage windows as Ethan began the delicate process of replacing the damaged wiring harness. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something different in his approach, a careful documentation of each step, an attention to detail that went beyond simple repair to encompass understanding that could be shared and taught. "Tell me what you're doing," Isabella said, positioning herself where she could observe the work without interfering. "Creating a permanent solution instead of a temporary fix." Ethan's voice carried the authority of someone who had finally found solid ground after months of sinking. The original harness was designed to meet minimum specifications for normal operating conditions. We're upgrading it to handle extreme conditions that should never occur but sometimes do. Lila looked up from her computer, where she'd been researching thermal protection methods used in aerospace applications. "Dad, what if we added a secondary temperature monitoring system?" something that could alert the driver if the engine bay temperature exceeds safe parameters. The suggestion stopped Ethan mid-motion. He'd been thinking like a mechanic focused on fixing the immediate problem. His daughter was thinking like an engineer, considering how to prevent future problems through intelligent monitoring. That's brilliant, kiddo. A predictive maintenance system instead of just reactive repair. Isabella's eyes brightened with recognition. That kind of thinking is exactly what the automotive industry needs. Not just fixing problems after they occur, but designing systems that prevent problems from developing in the first place. Ethan resumed his work, but his mind was now operating on multiple levels: the immediate challenge of the repair, the broader implications of the solution, and the growing realization that what he was doing in this moment was exactly what Isabella's company needed him to do on a larger scale. The replacement harness was military specification wire, rated for temperature extremes far beyond what any automotive application would encounter. Each connection was made with precision that bordered on obsession, sealed with materials designed to last decades rather than years, protected with heat shielding that transformed potential failure points into bulletproof reliability. "This is taking longer than a typical repair," Isabella observed, but there was no impatience in her voice, only curiosity about methods that differed from standard automotive service. "Because this isn't a typical repair. This is engineering improvement disguised as maintenance." Ethan paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of clean skin in the honest grime of hard work. Anyone can replace a broken part, but understanding why it broke and preventing it from breaking again, that's the difference between mechanics and problem solvers. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation drifted from immediate technical details to larger questions about innovation industry and the role of practical wisdom in solving complex problems. Isabella shared stories about manufacturing challenges that had cost millions of dollars and months of delays because engineers had designed solutions that looked perfect on paper but failed in real-world applications. Ethan countered with examples of simple fixes that had solved complicated problems, repairs that succeeded because they addressed root causes instead of obvious symptoms. "There's a philosophical difference here," Isabella said, watching Ethan test each connection with meticulous care. "Most of my engineers approach problems by trying to eliminate variables, control conditions, create perfect laboratory environments. You seem to embrace the chaos work with the reality that conditions are never perfect. Because machines don't live in laboratories. They live in the real world, where temperature changes and vibration and human error affect everything." Ethan secured the last connection and began routing the new harness through protective channels that would shield it from heat and mechanical stress. "You can't solve real-world problems with theoretical solutions. You have to understand how theory translates into practice." Lila had been quiet for the last hour, but now she looked up from her notebook with an expression that reminded Ethan painfully of her mother when Maria had been working through a particularly challenging physics problem. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Isabella, about finding people who can bridge the gap between different types of knowledge. What if that's not just about individual expertise? What if it's about creating teams that combine different perspectives?" Isabella's attention sharpened. "Explain what you mean." "Well, traditional automotive companies separate design, engineering, manufacturing, and service into different departments. But hybrid and electric systems don't respect those boundaries. You need people who understand how design decisions affect manufacturing processes, how manufacturing choices impact service requirements, how service experience informs better design." Ethan straightened up from his work, suddenly seeing his daughter's insight with perfect clarity. She's talking about integrated thinking. Instead of specialists who only understand their piece of the puzzle, you need generalists who can see how all the pieces connect. Like a master mechanic who understands not just how to fix cars, but how they're designed and built and what makes them break down in the first place, Isabella said slowly, the implications clicking into place in her mind. Exactly. And like an engineer who doesn't just calculate stress loads and efficiency ratios, but understands what it's like to actually work on the systems they design. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the Rolls-Royce's starter motor engaging. Ethan had completed the wiring replacement and was ready for the moment of truth, whether months of frustration and thousands of dollars in failed repairs could be resolved with careful diagnosis and proper execution. The V12 engine came to life with the smooth authority of mechanical precision, but this time there was no hesitation, no irregular rhythm, no suggestion of problems lurking beneath the surface. The engine purred with the contentment of a machine that had finally been properly understood and correctly repaired. "Listen to that," Ethan said with quiet satisfaction. "That's the sound of a problem that's been permanently solved." Isabella moved closer to the car, her trained ear trying to detect any hint of the irregularities that had plagued her for months. The engine note was smooth and steady, each cylinder contributing its voice to a mechanical chorus that sang with perfect harmony. "It sounds different," she said with wonder. "Not just fixed better than it was before." "Because it is better. The original harness was adequate for normal conditions. This one is designed for excellence under any conditions." Ethan let the engine run at idle for several minutes, monitoring temperature readings and performance parameters. But the real test comes under load, when the engine has to work hard and generate the kind of heat stress that caused the original problem. He shut off the engine and moved to close the hood, but Isabella stopped him with a gesture. "Wait, I want to understand something." She studied the engine bay, seeing it not as mysterious complexity, but as organized logic under Ethan's patient explanation. "How do I know this won't happen again? How do I know the next mechanic who works on this car will understand what you've done?" Ethan smiled and reached for a folder he'd been compiling throughout the repair process. Inside were detailed photographs of each step, technical specifications for the upgraded components, temperature ratings, and installation procedures that would guide future service. "Complete documentation. Anyone who works on your car from now on will know exactly what's been modified and why." He handed her the folder with the pride of someone who had done work that would last. "But more than that, you'll know what questions to ask. You'll understand your car well enough to make sure it gets the care it deserves." The gesture was small but profound, not just fixing a problem, but empowering the owner to prevent future problems through knowledge and understanding. It was exactly the kind of thinking that separated true craftsmen from simple service providers. "Mr. Cole," Isabella said formally, then caught herself. "Ethan, this is exactly what I've been looking for. Not just technical expertise, but the wisdom to create solutions that last." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Lila's phone buzzing with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her face lit up with excitement. "Dad, it's Mrs. Henderson from the high school guidance office." She wanted to talk about scholarship applications. Ethan felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Scholarship applications meant deadlines and requirements, and the constant reminder that his daughter's brilliance might not be enough to overcome their financial limitations. "Take it, kiddo. But remember, we still haven't figured out—" "Actually," Isabella interrupted gently, "I think we have figured it out. If Ethan is going to join my company, and if Lila is going to spend summers working on research projects, I suspect the financial aspects of her education are going to work themselves out quite naturally." The words hung in the air like a promise, transforming anxiety into possibility. Lila answered her phone and moved toward the office area for privacy, but her excitement was evident in every step. "You're serious about the consulting work?" Ethan asked. "I'm serious about all of it. The consulting work is just the beginning." Isabella pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. "I'm going to call my chief technical officer right now and arrange for you to visit our main facility next week. I want you to see what we're working on, meet the team, understand the scope of what we could accomplish together. And if I don't think it's a good fit, then you keep the consulting fees, and we remain friends who solved an impossible car problem together." "But Ethan, I don't think that's going to happen." As Isabella made her call, arranging meetings and introductions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to turning possibilities into reality, Ethan found himself staring at the Rolls-Royce with new eyes. It wasn't just a luxury car that had been repaired. It was a symbol of what could happen when the right people found each other at exactly the right moment. Lila returned from her phone call with a smile that could have powered the garage's electrical system. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. Mrs. Henderson says there's a new scholarship program specifically for students interested in sustainable automotive engineering. Full ride to MIT plus summer internships with partner companies. Partner companies like mine," Isabella added, having finished her own call. "I helped design that scholarship program specifically to identify and develop the next generation of automotive engineers." The convergence of events felt less like coincidence than like destiny finally getting its act together. Ethan looked at his daughter, brilliant and excited, and finally seeing a clear path toward the future she'd been dreaming about, then at Isabella, successful and visionary, and offering him an opportunity to use his skills on a scale he'd never imagined possible. "There's something I need to do before we go any further," Ethan said, moving toward the Rolls-Royce with sudden purpose. "What's that?" "A proper road test. The real proof of any repair isn't how it works in the garage. It's how it performs under real-world conditions." Isabella nodded and tossed him the keys. "Where do you want to go?" "Somewhere that will stress the engine, generate heat, create the exact conditions that caused the original problem. If our repair is going to fail, I want it to fail now, when we can fix it properly." They climbed into the Rolls-Royce, Ethan behind the wheel, Isabella in the passenger seat, Lila in the back with her notebook, and an expression of barely contained excitement. The interior still felt like a luxury spaceship, but now it was familiar territory rather than alien landscape. Ethan guided the car out of the garage and into the Detroit afternoon, navigating through neighborhoods that told the story of America's industrial past and uncertain future. Abandoned factories stood like monuments to prosperity that had moved elsewhere, but there were also signs of renewal. Small businesses opening in reclaimed spaces, community gardens blooming in vacant lots. People who refused to give up on places that had been written off by the larger economy. "This is where I grew up," Ethan said, turning onto a street lined with houses that had seen better decades. "Where I learned that fixing things matters more than replacing them, that understanding how something works is more valuable than just knowing how to operate it." Isabella studied the neighborhood with the analytical eye of someone who understood economic development and community transformation. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "More desperation, I suppose. More surrender. Instead, I see resilience. People who are rebuilding instead of abandoning, who are creating opportunities instead of waiting for someone else to provide them." That's Detroit. We've been counted out so many times that we've stopped listening to the obituaries. Ethan guided the Rolls-Royce onto the highway, where he could test the engine under the kind of sustained load that had triggered the original failures. The V12 responded with smooth, linear power delivery, accelerating through the gears with the effortless authority of mechanical precision. There was no hesitation, no irregularity, no suggestion that months of frustration had ever existed. How does it feel? Isabella asked. Perfect. But the real test comes when we've been driving for an hour and the engine bay is fully heat-soaked. Ethan settled into highway cruising speed, monitoring the instrument panel, with the careful attention of someone who understood that success had to be measured over time, not just in moments. They drove through the suburbs and exurbs past shopping centers and subdivision developments that represented the migration of prosperity away from the urban core. But they also drove past new manufacturing facilities, research centers, and technology companies that suggested the beginning of economic renewal. Tell me about your vision for the research facility, Ethan said, as the miles accumulated beneath them. A place where theoretical knowledge meets practical wisdom, Isabella replied, her voice carrying the excitement of someone describing a dream that was finally within reach. Where engineers who understand computer models can work alongside mechanics, who understand how machines actually behave in the real world. And you think that combination would be more effective than traditional approaches? I know it would be. The automotive industry's biggest challenges right now aren't theoretical, they're practical. How do you manufacture hybrid systems reliably? How do you service electric vehicles in communities that don't have specialized training? How do you integrate new technology with existing infrastructure? Lila leaned forward from the back seat, her notebook balanced on her knees as she sketched concepts and connections. What if the research facility wasn't just about solving technical problems? What if it was also about education? Training the next generation of mechanics to work on hybrid and electric systems. Isabella turned to study Lila with growing admiration. You're thinking about workforce development, not just technology development. Exactly. All the best engineering in the world won't matter if there aren't people who know how to implement it, maintain it, repair it when it breaks. Ethan felt pride swelling in his chest like a perfectly tuned engine reaching peak efficiency. His daughter was thinking at a level that encompassed not just technical solutions, but social and economic implications, understanding that sustainable technology required its sustainable communities of people who could support it. Where would you want to build this facility? He asked. Isabella's answer came without hesitation. Detroit. Where the automotive industry was born, where there's an existing workforce with mechanical expertise, where economic development could have the biggest positive impact. And where you could hire people like my father, Ethan said quietly, who understand machines at a level that can't be taught in schools, but has to be learned through years of patient practice. Exactly like your father, and like you. They had been driving for over an hour, the Rolls-Royce performing flawlessly, under conditions that would have triggered the original problem. The engine ran smooth and steady, the temperature gauge held rock solid in the normal range, and every system responded with the precision of a machine that had been properly understood and correctly repaired. I think it's time to head back, Ethan said, taking the next exit and beginning the return journey to the garage. But as they drove through downtown Detroit, Isabella made an unexpected request. Can you make a detour? There's something I want to show you. Following her directions, Ethan guided the Rolls-Royce through the city center to a large industrial building that had been renovated with obvious care and considerable investment. The sign out front read, Grant Industries Research and Development Center, opening soon. This is your facility? Ethan asked, pulling into the parking lot. One of them. We broke ground 6 months ago, but I've been waiting for the right person to help me define what it should become. Isabella stepped out of the car and moved toward the building entrance. Would you like to see what we're working with? The interior was a blend of cutting-edge technology and practical workspace designed for projects that required both theoretical precision and hands-on implementation. Clean rooms for sensitive electronics stood adjacent to machine shops equipped with tools that could fabricate anything from precision components to full vehicle prototypes. Computer workstations were positioned near test bays where engineers could immediately validate their theoretical models against physical reality. "This is incredible." Lila breathed, her voice filled with the wonder of someone seeing her dreams made tangible. "It could be," Isabella replied. "With the right leadership, the right vision, the right combination of practical experience and innovative thinking." Ethan walked through the facility with growing understanding of what Isabella was offering. Not just a job, but a chance to help create something that could transform an entire industry's approach to problem-solving and innovation. A place where his mechanical intuition could combine with cutting-edge technology to develop solutions that neither could achieve alone. "The position we discussed," Isabella said, as they completed their tour. "It would be based here. Technical Director for Practical Applications with authority to hire staff, define projects, establish partnerships with educational institutions, including MIT. Especially MIT. Lila could spend summers here working on research projects, learning from people who understand both theory and practice, contributing to solutions that could affect millions of vehicles." The vision was so compelling, so perfectly aligned with everything Ethan valued about work and innovation and making a positive difference in the world, that he felt his last reservations crumbling like old insulation in an overheated engine bay. They returned to the garage as the sun was setting over Detroit, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that made even the struggling neighborhood look beautiful. The Rolls-Royce had performed flawlessly throughout the extended test drive, proving that careful diagnosis and proper repair could solve problems that had frustrated specialists with far more credentials and expensive equipment. "So," Isabella said, as they stood beside the perfectly running car, "what's your decision?" Ethan looked around his garage one more time, seeing it not as a refuge from the world, but as the foundation for everything he was about to build. The tools that had belonged to his father, the workbenches where he'd taught his daughter to understand machines, the evidence of 4 decades spent making broken things whole again. None of it was being abandoned. All of it was being transformed into something larger and more impactful. "When do I start?" he asked. Isabella's smile was brilliant as Detroit's sunrise. "How about Monday?" "Dad," Lila said quietly, "are you sure about this?" Ethan put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility that came with making choices that would affect not just his own future, but hers as well. "Kiddo, your mother used to say that the biggest risk isn't trying and failing. It's not trying at all, and spending your whole life wondering what could have been." He looked at Isabella, then at the research facility that represented everything they could accomplish together. "I think it's time to find out what we're really capable of." 6 months later, the Cole Institute for Practical Innovation held its grand opening in the heart of Detroit. The facility buzzed with activity as engineers and mechanics worked side by side solving problems that had challenged the automotive industry for decades. Traditional combustion engines were being integrated with electric systems using approaches that combined theoretical precision with practical wisdom. Manufacturing processes were being redesigned to accommodate both existing infrastructure and emerging technology. Ethan stood in his new office watching his daughter work with college interns on hybrid integration problems that would have challenged graduate students. Through the windows, he could see the city of Detroit beginning to transform as new industries and opportunities took root in neighborhoods that had been written off by conventional wisdom. Isabella appeared in his doorway holding 2 cups of coffee that was still terrible but had somehow become their shared ritual. "Any regrets?" she asked. Ethan accepted the coffee and gestured toward the bustling facility where practical experience and theoretical knowledge were combining to create solutions neither could have achieved alone. "Just one," he said. "What's that?" "I wish Maria could see what we've built here. She always believed that the most important innovations come from understanding how everything connects to everything else." Isabella's voice was soft with understanding. "I think she can see it, and I think she's proud." Outside the windows, the Rolls-Royce sat in the executive parking area running perfectly after tens of thousands of trouble-free miles. It had become more than just a repaired vehicle. It was a symbol of what could happen when the right people found each other at exactly the right moment, when practical wisdom met visionary thinking, when the courage to dream big enough to change the world finally found the tools and opportunity to make those dreams reality. The transformation had begun with a broken car and a desperate customer seeking help in a struggling garage. It had grown into something that would affect millions of vehicles, thousands of workers, and entire communities that had learned to create their own opportunities rather than wait for salvation from somewhere else. In Detroit, where the automotive industry had been born and where it was being reborn, the future was being built one perfectly diagnosed problem at a time, one properly executed solution at a time, one partnership between practical wisdom and innovative vision at a time. The American dream, it turned out, wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for the right mechanic to figure out what was really wrong and fix it properly.